The cold English Channel waters churned beneath the landing craft as Private First Class Robert Sullivan gripped his rifle with white knuckles. It was 5:30 in the morning on June 6, 1944, and the largest seaborne invasion in human history was about to begin. Through the spray and darkness, he could barely make out the ominous silhouette of the French coastline ahead Omaha Beach, where German machine gun nests waited like hungry predators. 10 minutes, shouted Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder. Over the roar of engines and crashing waves, the men of the 2nd Ranger Battalion pressed closer together in their Higgins boats, each lost in private prayers and final thoughts of home. Sullivan's hands trembled not from the cold, but from the weight of what lay ahead. Behind them, the greatest armada ever assembled, stretched to the horizon over 5,000 ships carrying 150,000. Allied soldiers toward the fortress walls of Nazi-occupied Europe. General Dwight David Eisenhower had given the order just hours before, despite weather reports that nearly canceled the entire operation. "Okay, we'll go," he had said simply, knowing that the fate of the free world hung on this single decision. The Supreme Allied Commander had already written a letter accepting full responsibility should the invasion fail, a testament to the enormous stakes at play, as documented in Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive account D-Day, June 6, 1944. The planning for Operation Overlord had consumed 2 years of meticulous preparation involving deception, campaigns, massive troop buildups, and technological innovations that would revolutionize modern warfare. The first wave of assault troops began hitting the beaches at 6:30. At Utah Beach, the 4th Infantry Division encountered lighter resistance than expected, but at Omaha, hell itself seemed to erupt from the bluffs. Sullivan's boat lurched violently as German artillery shells exploded in towering waterspouts. Around them, the coxswain at the helm struggled to maintain course as machine gun bullets pinged off the steel ramp ahead. 30 seconds came the cry, barely audible above the chaos. Sullivan could see other landing craft already at the shoreline, their ramps dropping to disgorge American soldiers into the murderous crossfire. Many men never made it past the surf, cut down before they could take their first steps on European soil. The carefully planned beach assault was dissolving into desperate, individual struggles for survival. Colonel George Taylor of the 16th Infantry Regiment would later shout the words that embodied the spirit of that terrible morning. "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. Now, let's get the hell out of here." His cry would echo across Omaha Beach as scattered groups of soldiers began the seemingly impossible task of scaling the defended bluffs. At Point du Hoc, Rudder's Rangers faced an equally daunting challenge. They had to scale 100-foot cliffs under direct enemy fire to silence German artillery positions that threatened both Omaha and Utah beaches. Armed with rope ladders and grappling hooks, these elite soldiers embodied the audacious spirit of the entire invasion. Meanwhile, overhead, Allied paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were already fighting for their lives in the Norman countryside. Dropped hours before dawn behind enemy lines. Many had been scattered by German anti-aircraft fire and strong winds. Small groups of Americans found themselves isolated in unfamiliar territory. Relying on cricket noisemakers to identify friend from foe in the darkness, the German defenders, commanded by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had spent months preparing. Their Atlantic Wall fortifications, concrete bunkers, steel obstacles, and interlocking fields of fire turned the beaches into killing zones. Yet despite their preparations, the speed and scale of the Allied assault caught many German units off guard. Critical reinforcements, including panzer divisions, remained held in reserve by a German high command that initially believed the Normandy landings were merely a diversion. As Sullivan's landing craft ground against the sand and pebbles of Omaha Beach, the ramp dropped with a metallic clang that seemed to echo across eternity. Before him lay 200 yards of beach that would determine whether democracy would survive or perish in the 20th century. The ramp crashed down with a thunderous clang, and immediately the men in front of Sullivan crumpled under the withering German machine gun fire. Bullets whined overhead like deadly hornets as he plunged into chest-deep, freezing water that turned crimson with blood. Equipment-laden soldiers sank beneath the waves, their desperate cries lost in the cacophony of battle that would forever define June 6, 1944. "Move, move, move," screamed Sergeant Michael O'Brien, but half his squad was already floating face down in the surf. Sullivan struggled through the water, his waterlogged pack dragging him down as mortar. Shells exploded in geysers of sand and seawater. The carefully planned assault had devolved into chaos within minutes of hitting the beach. Colonel Charles Canham of the 29th Infantry Division stumbled onto the sand with his right hand nearly severed by shrapnel, yet continued to rally his men forward. "They're murdering us here," he shouted, pointing toward the bluffs where German MG-42 machine guns carved deadly arcs through the advancing Americans. "Let's move inland and get ourselves murdered." The pre-invasion naval bombardment had failed catastrophically.
Admiral.
Alan Kirk's fleet had pounded the beach defenses for hours, but most shells had fallen inland, leaving the German fortifications intact. Now those concrete bunkers and steel-reinforced positions were exacting a terrible price from the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions. Attempting to cross the killing ground of Omaha Beach, Sullivan dove behind a steel beach obstacle called a check hedgehog, its twisted metal providing scant protection from the bullets that sparked off its surface. Around him, the beach resembled a vision from Dante's Inferno. Wounded men cried for medics who couldn't reach them. Landing craft continued to arrive, disgorging more soldiers into the meat grinder, while German artillery observers on the bluffs called down increasingly accurate fire. Captain Joe Dawson of Company G, 16th Infantry, found himself pinned down with the remnants of his unit near the Vierville Draw. German machine gunners had perfect fields of fire from their elevated positions, and every attempt to advance was met with devastating crossfire. The situation grew so desperate that General Omar Bradley, watching from the command ship USS Augusta, seriously considered abandoning the Omaha assault entirely. At 7:15 in the morning, Brigadier General Norman Cota of the 29th Infantry Division landed on the beach and immediately began organizing the scattered survivors. Moving from group to group under heavy fire, he shouted encouragement and tactical orders that would prove crucial to the day's outcome. "Gentlemen, we're being killed here just as surely as we'll be killed inland," he declared. "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead and those about to die. The German defenders, members of the experienced 352nd Infantry Division, had been expecting this assault for months. Unlike other sectors where green troops manned the Atlantic Wall, these veterans knew exactly how to maximize their defensive advantages." Major Werner Pluskat, observing from his concrete bunker, watched with professional satisfaction as his carefully planned killing zones functioned exactly as designed. Sullivan finally reached the seawall, a low concrete barrier that provided the first real protection since leaving the landing craft. Blood streamed down his face from shrapnel cuts, and his rifle was clogged with sand and seawater. Beside him, Lieutenant William Ray gathered survivors from multiple units, creating ad hoc assault teams from the chaos. "Rangers, lead the way," came a cry from somewhere to the right, where elements of the 5th Ranger Battalion were attempting to scale the bluffs through a narrow gully. These elite soldiers, trained for exactly this type of impossible mission, began the precarious climb, up paths barely wider than a man's shoulders. By 8 o'clock, the situation had become so critical that destroyers moved dangerously close to shore, their 5-inch guns providing point-blank fire support. USS McCook and USS Carmack scraped their keels on the sandy bottom as they engaged German positions that land-based artillery couldn't reach. Their intervention would prove decisive in breaking the deadlock that threatened to turn today into an unmitigated disaster. The tide was rising, reducing the beach's width and concentrating the carnage into an even smaller area. Time was running out for the men of Omaha Beach. By 9 o'clock on that fateful June morning, small groups of American soldiers had begun to find gaps in the seemingly impregnable German defenses. Sergeant Philip Strechik of the 2nd Ranger Battalion led 12 men up a narrow ravine between the Vierville and St. Laurent Draws, using Bangalore torpedoes to blast through wire obstacles that had channeled attackers into predetermined killing zones. Sullivan followed Lieutenant Ray's improvised assault team as they worked their way up the treacherous bluff face. German defenders rolled grenades down the slope, forcing the Americans to press themselves against the cliff face, while explosions showered them with dirt and rock fragments. Above them, machine gun positions that had seemed invincible from the beach were vulnerable to attack from their flanks and rear. "Fire in the hole!" shouted Corporal Thomas Bedford as he detonated a satchel charge against a concrete pillbox. The explosion sent smoke and debris cascading down the bluff temporarily, blinding both attackers and defenders. In that crucial moment, Ray's men rushed forward, overwhelming the German position with grenades and rifle fire. The breakthrough came not from any single heroic action, but from dozens of small unit initiatives across the 5-mile stretch of Omaha Beach. Captain Joe Dawson's Company G had fought their way inland through the Colville Draw, while elements of the 116th Infantry Regiment advanced through gaps blown in the wire by Navy demolition teams, working under impossible conditions. Colonel George Taylor's famous exhortation, "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die," had become reality as increasing numbers of American soldiers chose forward movement over certain death on the sand. The psychological momentum was shifting, even as casualties mounted with each yard gained, as reported in Cornelius Ryan's authoritative account, "The Longest Day." The German defenders were beginning to feel the strain of continuous combat. Many positions had been cut off from their command structure, forcing individual squad and platoon leaders to make crucial decisions without higher guidance. Ammunition was running low in several key bunkers, and the pre-planned withdrawal routes were already compromised by American infiltration. Major Werner Pluskat, commanding the German artillery observation post overlooking Omaha, watched with growing concern as American soldiers appeared on the bluff tops behind his carefully constructed defensive line. His radio communications with higher headquarters had been severed by Allied bombing, leaving him increasingly isolated as the battle raged around his position. Sullivan's squad reached the top of the bluff at 10:20, gasping for breath after the grueling climb. Before them stretched the Norman countryside greenfields, divided by the distinctive hedgerows that would dominate fighting for the next 7 weeks. But first, they had to clear the remaining German positions that still commanded the beach approaches. The village of Colville-sur-Mer had been transformed into a fortress, with every house converted into a strong point. American soldiers advanced from building to building, using tactics they had never been taught in training. Rifle grenades and satchel charges replaced the elaborate fire and maneuver doctrines that proved useless in close-quarters urban combat. Sergeant Stretchek's Rangers had meanwhile advanced nearly a mile inland, establishing the deepest Allied penetration of the day. Their success demonstrated that the Atlantic Wall, while formidable at the waterline, was vulnerable once breached. German defensive planning had focused almost exclusively on stopping the invasion at the beach, with insufficient preparation for defense in depth. By noon, organized German resistance on the Omaha bluffs was collapsing. Individual strongpoints continued to fight, but the coordinated defense that had made the morning assault so costly was breaking down under relentless American pressure. Navy destroyers continued to provide close-fire support, their accurate gunnery silencing positions that ground forces couldn't reach. The price had been terrible, for 2,000 American casualties on Omaha Beach alone. But the Western Allies had established their crucial foothold in occupied Europe. Landing craft continued to arrive throughout the day, bringing reinforcements, supplies, and the vehicles that would sustain the advance inland. As Sullivan cleaned his rifle and prepared for the next phase of the battle, he could hear the sound of tanks being unloaded on the beach below. The invasion of Nazi Europe had survived its bloodiest test. The hedgerows of Normandy loomed like green walls before the advancing American forces as they pushed inland from the bloodied beaches. These ancient field boundaries, some dating back centuries, had been transformed by German ingenuity into a defensive network that would challenge Allied forces for weeks to come. Each bocage field became a separate battlefield, forcing soldiers to fight yard by yard through terrain that seemed designed for ambush and slaughter. Technical Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron stared at the impenetrable hedge before his Sherman tank crew. These earthen barriers, topped with centuries of growth, rose 8 to 12 feet high and were too thick for tanks to penetrate. German defenders had turned each field into a fortress, with carefully prepared positions that commanded all approaches. "We need to find a way through these damned things," muttered Staff Sergeant Robert Watson, peering through his periscope at the seemingly endless maze of hedgerows stretching toward the horizon. Intelligence reports had mentioned the Bocage country, but nothing had prepared the Americans for the reality of fighting. In this natural fortress that favored defenders over attackers, Private Sullivan, now attached to a provisional rifle company advancing toward the village of Formini, crawled along a hedgerow base while German snipers searched for targets. 3 days after the successful D-Day landings, the euphoria of breakthrough was giving way to the grinding reality of Norman warfare. Every field crossing required careful coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery, yet German defenders seemed to anticipate every American move. The German 7th Army, commanded by Colonel General Friedrich Dollmann, had recovered from the initial shock of the invasion and was implementing a defense in depth, maximized the natural advantages of the Norman terrain. Unlike the static fortifications of the Atlantic Wall, this new defensive strategy relied on mobility, camouflage, and intimate knowledge of local conditions. Sergeant Cullen's breakthrough came through battlefield innovation rather than tactical doctrine. Working with other tank crews, he developed improvised steel prongs nicknamed rhino horns that could be welded to Sherman tank fronts. These devices, fashioned from German beach obstacles, allowed tanks to punch through hedgerows without exposing their vulnerable undersides to enemy fire. According to military historian Stephen Ambrose's detailed research in Citizen Soldiers, this type of frontline innovation characterized the American response to unexpected battlefield conditions throughout the Norman campaign. Formal military doctrine proved inadequate for the unique challenges of Bocage warfare, forcing individual soldiers and small units to develop creative solutions under combat conditions. The village of WWII fell to elements of the 5th Corps on June 8th, providing the Americans with their first significant inland objective. However, progress remained agonizingly slow as German resistance stiffened around key transportation hubs. The port city of Cherbourg, essential for Allied logistics, remained firmly in German hands, despite increasing pressure from advancing American forces. Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudders, Rangers, having survived the carnage at Point du Hoc, found themselves fighting a different kind of battle as they advanced through the labyrinthine hedgerow country. Their specialized assault training proved less relevant than basic infantry skills as they engaged German defenders who knew every path and hiding place in their native countryside. Major General Leonard Jarrow, commanding the 5th Corps, established his headquarters in a Norman farmhouse that still bore scars from German artillery. His staff worked around the clock to coordinate the complex logistics of maintaining his offensive operations while simultaneously building up forces for the broader breakout that would eventually carry Allied armies to the German border. The German defenders, primarily elements of the 914th and 915th Infantry Regiments, fought with the desperation of men who knew that failure meant the collapse of Nazi Germany's western defenses. Their resistance was particularly fierce around the approaches to St. Vith and Carrington, where American airborne forces were attempting to link up with seaborne units. Sullivan's company finally broke through the German defensive line east of Formini on June 10th. After 4 days of continuous fighting that advanced American positions less than 3 miles from their D-Day objectives, the cost had been severe, nearly 40% casualties in some rifle companies. But the Bocage was beginning to yield to American pressure and innovation. The ancient fortress city of Cherbourg stood like a defiant medieval castle at the tip of the Cotentin Peninsula, its massive concrete fortifications bristling with coastal artillery that could sink any Allied vessel attempting to enter the harbor. General Omar Bradley's First Army had been fighting toward this crucial port for 3 weeks, knowing that without Cherbourg's deep-water facilities, the entire Normandy campaign might collapse under logistical constraints. Major General J. Lawton Collins, commanding the 7th Corps, studied his maps in a bullet-scarred Norman farmhouse as artillery rumbled in the distance. His forces, the 4th, 9th, and 17th Infantry Divisions had finally cut across the peninsula's base. Isolating the German garrison, under Lieutenant General Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben, now came the difficult task of reducing a fortress that German engineers had spent 4 years preparing for exactly this assault. Staff Sergeant Curtis Cullen's Sherman tank, now equipped with the innovative hedge-cutting device his crew had developed, rumbled through the village of Monneborg. On June 19th, the bocage fighting had been replaced by a different challenge urban warfare against prepared defensive positions that turned every building into a potential strongpoint. "Contact front," shouted Corporal James Mitchell as German Panzerfaust teams engaged the advancing American armor. The narrow streets of Norman towns provided perfect ambush sites for anti-tank weapons, forcing tank crews to work closely with infantry squads that could clear buildings and rooftops of enemy observers. Private Sullivan, now a seasoned veteran, despite only 2 weeks of combat, led a fire team through the rubble-strewn streets of Valognes. German resistance was stiffening as American forces approached the outer defensive ring of Cherbourg itself. Every intersection required careful reconnaissance. Every building clearance risked casualties from booby traps and hidden snipers. The German defenders had learned harsh lessons from the DAA fighting and were implementing a more flexible defensive doctrine. Rather than manning static positions until overwhelmed, they conducted fighting withdrawals that inflicted maximum casualties while preserving combat effectiveness. This tactical evolution made American advances increasingly costly as they approached Cherbourg's main defenses. Lieutenant General von Schlieben commanded approximately 40,000 German troops, including regular infantry, coastal artillery, units, and hastily organized labor battalions pressed into service as combat soldiers. His orders from Field Marshal Rommel were explicit: hold Cherbourg at all costs and, if forced to abandon the city, destroy the port facilities completely, as documented in Max Hastings' comprehensive study Overlord D-Day and the Battle for Normandy. The Cherbourg operation represented the first major urban assault conducted by American forces in the European theater. Lessons learned during this campaign would prove invaluable during later battles in German cities, but the learning curve was steep and paid for in American blood. Captain Robert Murphy's Company B, 121st Infantry Regiment, approached the village of Tourlaville. On June 20th, under cover of an intensive artillery barrage, the German defenders had established interlocking fields of fire that covered all approaches to their positions, forcing American infantry to advance. Through deadly killing zones under direct observation, the breakthrough came through combined arms coordination that had been perfected during weeks of bocage fighting. Tank destroyers provided direct fire support, while infantry squads maneuvered through gaps blown in enemy positions by artillery and airstrikes. Close air support from P-47 Thunderbolts proved particularly effective against German strong points that dominated key terrain features. Sergeant Kulin's tank crew supported the infantry advance by engaging German positions that were invisible to ground observers. Their innovative hedgerow-cutting device had proven equally effective against concrete obstacles and wire entanglements that protected Cherbourg's outer defenses. The psychological impact of American armor operating so close to German positions was often as important as the actual firepower it provided. By June 21st, American forces had penetrated Cherbourg's outer defensive ring at multiple points. German resistance remained fierce, but the writing was on the wall. Von Schlieben's garrison was running low on ammunition and supplies, while American reinforcements continued to arrive from the expanding beachhead in southern Normandy. The final assault on Cherbourg would require everything the Americans had learned about combined arms warfare during their bloody apprenticeship in the Norman hedgerows. The final assault on Cherbourg began at dawn on June 22nd.
1944.
With the largest artillery barrage American forces had yet conducted in the European theater. Over 300 guns pounded German defensive positions as P-47 Thunderbolts and Royal Air Force Typhoons screamed overhead, their rockets and bombs systematically destroying the concrete fortifications that protected this vital Atlantic port. Lieutenant General von Schlieben watched from his command bunker deep beneath Fort du Roule as American shells obliterated positions he had spent months preparing. His remaining forces, fewer than 20,000 effective combat troops, faced Impossible odds against 3 full American infantry divisions supported by armor and overwhelming air superiority. Yet his orders remained unchanged. Defend Cherbourg to the last man and destroy the port facilities if defeat became inevitable. Sergeant Curtis Coulin's tank crew spearheaded the assault by the 79th Infantry Division against the heavily fortified Arsenal area, where German coastal artillery still commanded the harbor approaches. His Sherman, now battle-tested through 3 weeks of continuous combat, advanced through rubble-strewn streets while infantry squads cleared buildings on both flanks. "Panzerfaust, 2 o'clock," shouted Corporal Mitchell as a German anti-tank team emerged from a bombed building. The enemy rocket-propelled grenades streaked past their turret, exploding harmlessly against a concrete wall. Coulin traversed his main gun and fired a high-explosive shell that silenced the German position in a cloud of dust and debris. Private Sullivan's rifle company, now reduced to fewer than 60 men, after weeks of fighting, advanced toward the massive Fort du Roule complex that dominated Cherbourg's harbor. This 19th-century fortress had been modernized with concrete bunkers and interconnected tunnels that allowed defenders to shift positions without exposure to American fire. Reducing such a position would require tactics that combine medieval siege warfare with 20th-century technology. The German defenders fought with desperate courage, knowing that Cherbourg's fall would open a major supply port for the Allied armies. Machine gun teams held their positions until overrun, while artillery observers continued calling fire missions even as American infantry closed on their bunkers. Their resistance was particularly fierce around the submarine pens and dry dock facilities that represented years of German construction effort. Captain Robert Murphy coordinated the assault on Fort du Roule, using lessons learned during the Bocage fighting. Infantry squads armed with Bangalore torpedoes and satchel charges worked methodically through the fortress complex, clearing bunkers one by one while tank destroyers provided overwatch from positions that could engage German strongpoints directly. Breakthrough came when Technical Sergeant Paul Hurst of the 9th Infantry Division led a demolition team through a drainage tunnel that connected to the fort's main magazine. Their placement of explosive charges triggered a massive secondary explosion that collapsed several defensive positions and opened a gap in the German line that American assault troops immediately exploited. By noon on June 25th. Organized German resistance in Cherbourg was collapsing. Von Schlieben, his communications severed and his ammunition nearly exhausted, made the decision to surrender rather than see his remaining troops slaughtered in a hopeless defense. His capitulation formally ended German control of the Cotentin Peninsula and gave the Allies their first major port in occupied Europe. However, the German demolition efforts had been thorough and systematic. Harbor facilities, cranes, dry docks, and even the breakwaters had been destroyed with typical German engineering precision. American port reconstruction teams would require months to restore Cherbourg to operational status, forcing continued reliance on the artificial Mulberry harbors that had been towed across the English Channel. Sergeant Coulin's crew celebrated the victory with a meal of German rations discovered in an abandoned supply depot, their first hot food in 4 days. Around them, the city of Cherbourg burned from the effects of the 3-day battle. But American engineers were already beginning the massive task of clearing debris and restoring the port facilities that would sustain the advance toward Germany. The capture of Cherbourg represented a crucial milestone in the Battle of Normandy, but the larger campaign was far from over. German forces were regrouping south of the beachhead, preparing for the decisive battles that would determine whether the Allied invasion could break out of its Norman confines. Operation Cobra erupted like a thunderclap across the Norman countryside on July 25, 1944, as over 1,500 Allied bombers carpet-bombed German positions west of St. Vith. The concentrated aerial assault, followed immediately by the largest artillery barrage in American history, shattered the German defensive line that had contained Allied forces in their Norman beachhead for 7 brutal weeks. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley's master plan was finally coming to fruition. After weeks of attritional fighting that had bled both sides white, American forces were positioned for the breakthrough that would carry them across France and to the German border. The key was coordination's simultaneous pressure along the entire front that would prevent German commanders from shifting reserves to threatened sectors. Sergeant Curtis Cullen's tank, bearing the scars of 2 months' continuous combat, spearheaded the 1st Infantry Division's assault through the gap blown in German lines by the preliminary bombardment. His crew had survived Omaha Beach, the Bocage fighting, and the siege of Cherbourg, becoming veterans whose experience was invaluable in the fluid warfare that characterized the breakout phase. Movement to the front, called Corporal Mitchell. As German Panzer IV tanks appeared through the smoke and dust raised by Allied bombing, these were elements of the Panzerlehr Division, one of Germany's most experienced armored units, conducting a desperate counterattack designed to seal the American breakthrough before it could develop into a general collapse of German defenses. The tank battle that followed demonstrated how profoundly warfare had changed since D-Day. American crews, initially outclassed by superior German equipment and training, learned through bitter experience how to coordinate with infantry and artillery in ways that negated enemy technological advantages. Superior numbers, logistics, and air support were finally overwhelming German tactical excellence. Private Sullivan, now a squad leader despite his junior rank, led his men through the village of Marigny as German resistance crumbled along the entire front. The methodical, costly fighting of the Bocage campaign had been replaced by rapid advances that covered more ground in days than previous operations had gained in weeks. German units unable to establish new defensive lines, retreating in disorder toward the Seine River. Field Marshal Gunther von Klug, who had replaced the wounded Rommel as commander of Army Group B, recognized that the situation was becoming catastrophic. His orders from Adolf Hitler prohibited any withdrawal, but military reality made continued defense impossible. German divisions that had fought magnificently during the defensive phase were disintegrating under the weight of Allied material superiority and constant air attack. The Falaise pocket became Germany's canny as Allied forces converged on retreating. German armies trapped in an ever-shrinking cauldron. Canadian forces advancing from the north linked up with American units pushing from the south, encircling hundreds of thousands of German troops who lacked the fuel and ammunition necessary for continued resistance. According to Russell, Wegley's authoritative study Eisenhower's lieutenants, the destruction of German forces in the Falaise pocket effectively ended organized German resistance west of the Rhine River. Entire divisions ceased to exist as combat-effective units. Their personnel either killed, wounded, or captured during the chaotic retreat toward Germany. Sergeant Cullen's Sherman reached the Seine River on August 19th, marking the end of the Normandy campaign that had begun with such uncertainty on the beaches 76 days earlier. Behind them lay the battlefields where American forces had learned the harsh lessons of modern warfare against a determined and skillful enemy. Ahead lay the drive toward Germany itself and the final battles that would end the European War. The liberation of Paris on August 25th provided a triumphant conclusion to the campaign that had begun with such carnage on Omaha Beach. Private Sullivan marched down the Champs-Élysées with his unit, receiving flowers from French civilians who had endured for years of German occupation. The young soldier who had struggled through the surf on D-Day had become part of the army that would carry democracy's banner to Berlin. The Battle of Normandy was over. The race to Germany had begun.